All right, let's jump right in. We're going to break down a speech that, according to our source, really shook things up. We're talking about Senator Marco Rubio's address at the Munich Security Conference, a speech that outlined a really powerful and, pretty controversial new vision for the entire Western alliance.
So, what's the game plan? First, we gotta set the scene, right? What was the mood in the room? Then, we'll dive straight into the speech itself. What did Rubio see as the big problem facing the West? And more importantly, what was his solution? And then we'll wrap it all up by looking at why our source thinks this speech was such a big deal, maybe even a real turning point.
Okay, so to really get the impact of this speech, you have to put yourself in the room. We're at the Munich Security Conference. This is a huge deal, one of the biggest meetups of world leaders all year. And according to our source, the vibe was, well, it was tense, incredibly tense. Yeah, our source basically says the alliance was at its most fragile point in decades. You had all these nagging questions about who's paying for what in NATO, about America's role. There was this real feeling of uncertainty about the U.S. commitment.
And it all boiled down to this one huge question. Was America about to walk away? I mean, for leaders on both sides of the Atlantic, the future of the alliance really seemed like it was up for grabs. That created this backdrop of serious anxiety.
So it's into that supercharged atmosphere that Marco Rubio gets up to speak, and he delivers what our source calls a really consequential, maybe even historic, speech that was designed to give a crystal clear answer.
And right out of the gate, the speech tried to reframe the whole conversation. The argument was, look, this isn't about America ditching its allies. Think of it more like tough love, a deliberate push to start a difficult but really necessary conversation about making the alliance stronger for the challenges ahead.
And you know what? That message landed. It really landed. Our source points out that the room, which was packed with presidents, prime ministers, top generals, gave him a standing ovation. That tells you everything you need to know about its immediate impact. Okay, so what was the big problem this tough love was supposed to fix? Well, the speech argues that it all goes back to what it calls a foolish idea that really took root across the West right after the Cold War ended.
The speech basically zeroed in on what it called a dangerous delusion. This idea, after the Cold War, that we had reached the end of history. You know the theory, that every country was just going to naturally become a liberal democracy, and in this new globalized world, things like national borders and distinct cultures, well, they just wouldn't matter as much anymore.
And this is so important. The speech didn't just keep it theoretical. It drew a straight line from that philosophical delusion to what it described as very real, very negative consequences. The argument wasn't just some abstract debate. It was that these globalist ideas directly led to things like economic decline, losing control of your own country, and major social instability all across the West.
And all of that diagnosis led to this really pivotal question in the speech. If those old ideas failed, then what is this alliance actually for? The point being made was that armies don't risk their lives for something vague like a rules-based order. They fight for something much more real, something they can touch.
And the answer the speech gave? It was a major pivot, a call to defend Western civilization itself, this shared heritage built on a common history, a common culture, and faith. The call to action here wasn't about protecting some abstract set of international rules. It was about protecting a specific way of life.
Okay, so after laying out the problem, the speech didn't just stop there. It offered up a pretty clear plan for how to fix it, a path for renewal.
And it basically came down to three core pillars. First, re-industrialize. Bring manufacturing and those critical industries back home. Second, control your own national borders. This was framed as a fundamental act of being a sovereign country. And third, reform those big global institutions so they actually serve national interests, instead of trying to replace them.
And to really hammer home that third point, the need for reform, the speech pointed to these recent examples. The argument was that in huge global crises, institutions like the UN were pretty much powerless, and that it was ultimately direct American leadership and action that got things done. So the big picture here, the vision, is an alliance of nations that are actually proud of who they are, of their own heritage. The speech was a direct pushback against what it called a kind of managed decline that's fueled by guilt over the past. Instead, it was a call for a bold, confident revitalization.
All right, so let's bring it home. Why does our source claim this speech is going to be remembered for years to come? Well, it's because it did more than just defend a policy. It tried to completely reframe the entire debate about the future of the West. When you boil it all down, the core message was actually pretty simple and direct. Stronger allies make a stronger alliance. So this wasn't about America going it alone at all. It was more of a challenge to every single member of the alliance. Get your own house in order. Become stronger individually, economically, culturally, militarily, so that together the whole alliance becomes way more powerful and resilient.
And that right there is a huge shift in how the problem is diagnosed. Our source argues the speech moved the conversation away from just, hey, how can we get along better, to a much deeper question: what do we actually stand for? So in this new framing, the problem wasn't just a strained relationship. The real problem was a flawed ideology, a kind of complacency that had set in.
And that leaves us with a final, really big question to chew on. This speech offered one powerful vision, one that centered on national sovereignty, industrial strength, and cultural confidence. But it really forces all of us to ask, what does a truly reinvigorated Western alliance actually need to face the massive challenges of this century?